We're starting.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining. For everyone who is tuning in on their computers in these extraordinary times as we're trying to find a way to have important conversations like these while we can't all be together. So welcome to today's event, Responding to the Crisis, the Recovery and the Clean Energy Economy. And my name is Miro Karenha, and I'm the co-founder and publisher of e-news platform Our Daily Planet. And we're really thrilled to be putting on this event with Third Way and the University of Michigan, because this is really timely. We have, a lot of forces at play right now that could really make the difference for a clean energy future. And so we have a lot to talk about, and we're really thrilled by this panel that we have today, who all agreed to give up a little bit of their time on a Thursday. So I'll go ahead and introduce everyone. First, we have Ellen Hughes-Cromwick, and Ellen is a senior resident fellow at Third Way. She works there in the Climate and Clean Energy program. And Ellen also spent time as the chief economist at the US Department of Commerce during the Obama administration. And she was also the global economist at Ford Motor Company for several years. And Ellen wanted me to reiterate how grateful she is for our health workers and first responders in this time. And next we have Gilbert Campbell, and Gilbert is one of the co-founders and principals of Volt Energy. And Volt Energy is one of the largest minority-owned solar development firms that builds, operates, and maintains state-of-the-art solar energy systems for commercial, industrial, government, and educational institutions. And Daniel Rimey is a senior research associate at Resources for the Future and a lecturer at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy. His research focuses on a range of energy and climate-related topics. Resources for the Future's mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. And before we dive into our panel discussion, just a little bit of housekeeping. I know many of you probably can't see yourself on camera, but we can see you, you're all here, and we will reserve after the panel discussion 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So if you could hold your questions, you have a little button at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to submit those questions. So if you could hold off until we start that panel discussion, we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We see you, you're here, so this is great. And without further ado, we'll jump into our panel. So, the first question I have is that we received some data today on March auto jobs, vehicles, and sales, which were heavily affected by the crisis. And today we also got the jobs numbers. So Ellen, how do you think the development and deployment of electric vehicles and batteries will be impacted by the economic fallout and crisis?
Great, thanks for that opening question. And that's a really tough one, Miro. I do want to say, first off, that the jobless claims just zoomed up. I mean, we have a lot of people filing for unemployment insurance. It shot up, significantly today. We've got now, about 10 million people that have filed just in the last 2 weeks, and that's going to go up even more. So that just kind of gives people a sense of how significant this is. I mean, I just want to emphasize to everybody on the line, we are way beyond anything that we have ever really seen. It's almost as if we're getting 1929 to 1933 and the Great Depression in a very short period of time. The second stat I wanted to mention is that March vehicle sales came in at about 11 million units. And just to kind of give you a sense, that those sales were running at an annual rate of 17 million units. So we've had a big, real contraction of what's happening in the auto sector. To your question, there is no doubt that we are going to move ahead with electric vehicles, regardless of this health crisis or come what may in future years. We're seeing battery economics really get very competitive. And we've got our government labs, they're still doing great research. We've got a lot of private researchers that are developing great innovation on batteries. And as you probably have seen, you know, GM made this commitment. All AVs are going to be EVs. Everybody is going to electric vehicles. The issue, I guess, and I just want to close with this, is what's the time frame for that? You may have seen GM announced a couple of days ago that they're pushing out the product called the Chevy Bolt, which is their small battery electric vehicle. They're going to push it out another year, and they won't launch that till 2022. I think that's an example of what we're likely to see, you know, on EVs, that some of this could get delayed, but it's not going to change the trend. We are definitely moving toward electric vehicles.
Right, thank you for that. And Gilbert, as a business owner in the renewable energy space, how do you see overall jobs in the clean energy industry being affected either now or perhaps in the future as we, you know, deal with this crisis and experience the fallout?
Thank you. That's a great question. And first off, my prayers go out to everyone that is part of the figure that came out with unemployment today. As it relates to jobs in the clean energy space, according to Abigail Hopper, who's the CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association, the solar industry could lose up to 125,000 jobs just because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And WEA, which is the American Wind Energies Association, is expecting that they could lose up to 35,000 jobs, as well as the U.S. Energy Storage Association currently employs 60,000 Americans, and they're expecting significant job losses. So we talk about these numbers, but it's actual families and individuals that are being impacted. So again, you know, our prayers go out to everyone, and I hope we get through this pandemic and put together smart policy to get people back to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we've seen very quickly how this pandemic affected our economy. And Ellen, I wanted to jump back to you for a moment and ask, you know, how has coronavirus exposed some of the deep cracks in the foundation of our economy that perhaps we're seeing exacerbated now that this has devolved so rapidly?
Oh my gosh. And it's almost a Grand Canyon, not a crack. You know, how could we be in a situation where our system can't be proactive and get ahead of such a severe crisis like this? You know, Mira, we have had 3 major shocks in the last, 12 years or so. We had 9/11, we had the global financial crisis, and now we have a very severe health crisis. So we need to really get ahead and look at how can we be more strategic and systematic for future shocks that will come our way. And we know, and I hope our audience is really on this with us, we know that the climate risks are mounting and that we can't just sit back here and let that be the next shock to take us down. So I just want to emphasize, this is a lesson for all of us. The government has to be way more involved, way more proactive to make sure we have the leadership to address these Grand Canyons in our economy. And climate is right in the center of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the path forward? How can we build a stronger foundation for a greener economy? Because right now we're really kind of at a crossroads. We're going to have to re-examine a lot of our current economic systems. We're going to have to really prioritize what we invest in and how we invest in it in the future. So, what do you see as happening to get us on a better and a greener path?
Thanks, Miro, and thanks everyone for joining in. Since this is the first thing I'm saying today, I just want to emphasize Ellen and Gilbert's comments and just sending my thoughts and wishes to everybody who's out there who's struggling. We're all struggling in different ways, and just encourage everyone to be as kind and as generous as you can with your friends and your family and your neighbors, and just keep working to get through this together. the caveat that I would like to give before I try to answer that question is that, as Alan has clearly told us, we are in an unprecedented situation. And so whatever prognostication I can offer is with the caveat that I have no idea what's going to happen over the next several months. I can give some thoughts about things that I think would be productive or helpful as we go forward, rather than actually, trying to envision what the next steps are. So, we're going to talk more about this over the next 45 minutes or so. But to my thinking, we're in this unprecedented, difficult economic and social and health situation. The first thing to do is to, in my mind, not focus immediately on green spending, but first focus on, essentially, to use a medical analogy, stabilize the patient. So we need to stabilize the patient first. And as we look forward to the coming months and coming years, I think that is the appropriate time to think about, as the patient recovers, how do we encourage the patient to eat better? How do we encourage the patient to exercise more? And this is, a bad analogy for trying to reduce emissions across our economy. I think there are a variety of steps that we can take to do that. Some of them we can take in the relatively short term over the next couple of months, but there are larger policy changes that are probably not going to be part of any stimulus package that are still necessary to get us to deep decarbonization goals. Those include things like carbon pricing, long-term investment in research and development projects, and a variety of other sort of technological innovations that we're going to need to get to where we want to be 50, 75 years down the road. So I think there's room for smart decisions and smart investments with the short-term stimulus spending, but I think we also need to keep our eye on the long term at the same time.
Yeah, that's great. And I wanted to, Daniel wanted to ask one follow-up question. How much emphasis should we be putting on deployment of technologies? Because we talk a lot about R&D, but what do you think we could be doing to maybe take some of the existing technology that we have and perhaps deploy it at scale? I feel like that kind of gets left out of the conversation a lot.
Yeah, I think some of the major federal policies targeting renewable energy today are essentially deployment policies, right? The wind production tax credit, the solar investment tax credit, tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration, trying to deploy these things at larger and larger scale. And so I would expect that there would be maybe some tweaking around the edges of those deployment policies. For example, this will probably come up later, but one thing that happened during the 2009 Recovery Act, the stimulus bill, was that very popular tax credits for wind and solar facilities were converted temporarily into cash grants. So businesses could more easily get their hands on that capital to support investments going forward. And so those types of tweaks to existing policies, I think, could be quite useful in accelerating deployment of clean energy. But at the same time, I think there is going to be a lot of interest in accelerating deployment of pretty much any economic activity right now. And so I think green energy is sort of just one of many sectors where the government is going to be looking and saying, how can we get people back to work? How can we get investment flowing? And how can we get shovels in the dirt, so to speak?
Yeah, great. And as we're seeing in the midst of this crisis, the public might be averse to thinking big and investing in a greener, more sustainable economy. Folks may just want to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And I wanted to ask of all the panelists, we'll start with Ellen, but in your view, what sort of economic policy changes do we need that A, meet the size of the current challenge, and B, ensure that we're transitioning to a greener and healthier economy overall? I asked a little bit of that in my previous question, but I kind of wanted to get all of you in and, just see what you're thinking from your viewpoints as an economist, as a business owner in this sector. So Ellen, if we could start with you on that.
Okay, thanks for that question. It's a great question. I do want to dovetail exactly what Daniel said, which was, we have to stabilize the patient. So we have an economy right now that's entering a severe recession. And all of the stimulus that's been provided by the Fed and also by our federal government through the CARES Act, in addition to other actions that Congress and the administration have taken, all of that is to really fill the hole so that we cannot have a situation where this turns into a protracted downturn. That would not be good for any of what we think are important climate policies going forward. So first and foremost, we have to keep blocking and tackling and being proactive to stabilize the economy. Any economic policy from this point forward, and we know we're going to get it, is going to really help a lot of distressed companies, distressed industries, so that we can stop the hemorrhaging of layoffs. So first and foremost, we might see more money going into small businesses. I mean, they're going to give out $350 billion to help stabilize small business. That might not be enough. We may need to go back and have more small business support. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that. I think we're going to have to see more support for industries that could encounter very severe financial difficulty. And by the way, a lot of the companies, the people in those companies, there are thousands and thousands of workers in some of these industries. In automotive, there are 4 million people working in auto-related industries. If the auto sector encounters financial challenges, we're going to have to help the auto sector. So I think that's kind of first and foremost. And then I would say, when we stabilize and we think now we've got a good baseline, now we have to go with our policies, infrastructure, anything we can do to now strategically get us ready to limit, mitigate, reduce climate risks. And I think that's going to be such an important part of this longer term recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, I don't know if you spoke to this earlier, but I don't know if you had anything to add. I think the point of reducing climate risks is really critical. So is there anything you can speak to, to follow up on Ellen's point there?
Yeah, I agree with what Ellen was saying. And I would sort of tack on one further thought, which is when we talk about stabilizing the patient, we're talking about the economy, but it's also worth keeping in mind that to get the economy under, a better condition, we first need to get a handle on the virus itself. So I think we're all talking about, first and foremost, dealing with the public health crisis, and that will allow us to make these economic changes that we certainly need. Thinking over the long term about how we can achieve long-term climate goals and how sort of this situation might play into it, when we think about stimulus and we think about government spending to support renewables, those policies have been helpful to a substantial extent, but they have not been sufficient to really drive down emissions to the levels that we know are necessary to reach the goals laid out, for example, in the Paris Climate Accord of 1.5 or below 2 degrees Celsius. And so simply throwing money to subsidize technologies, whether they are emerging or whether they are, pretty mature at this point, is not going to be enough to create a true energy transition where we actually move away from the incumbent fuels of the past. My colleague Richard Newell and I have published a couple versions of an article where we basically look back in history, back to the 1800s, and what you see over history is that at a global scale, there really have never been any energy transitions where we move away from a fuel of the past like wood or coal or oil. Instead, if you look at the actual levels of consumption around the world, we use more oil today than we ever have. We use more natural gas than we ever have. We use more biomass than we ever have around the world, which is wood energy. And so to really make structural changes in the energy mix requires not just adding new energy sources on top of that existing stack, but actually implementing policies that move us away from more heavily emitting fuels. And that primarily means policies other than subsidies, policies other than spending, where we actually require the economy through carbon pricing or some other mechanism to internalize the externality associated with emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
That's great. And Gilbert, you are a business owner in this field. You know, you're seeing this in your job day to day. So what kind of policies do you think would help triage what's currently happening right now in your industry, and get you to a sounder footing? And then how can the government invest, you know, in companies such as yours in your industry to help it grow and flourish and you know, employ more people and build more solar?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I first off want to agree with what Daniel and Ellen said. I think the first thing we have to do is address the symptom, and that is the global health crisis that we're dealing with. Until we address that, and it's working, you know, with social distancing, but until we get people healthy, the side effect is the economy and jobs. And then a further side effect is jobs in the clean energy space. So we have to put all emphasis on dealing with that first. But what specifically can government do to help spur growth in solar and other renewable energy forms? There's some simple things that can be done. Daniel, you mentioned it earlier as far as the investment tax credit for solar and the production tax credit for wind. So for example, in solar for financing, we get a 30% tax credit for all solar investments. There's some projects that were done last year that have to be finished this year in order to get a certain percentage of the tax credits. Because projects, and some of our projects are being delayed, those projects may not get the tax credit for that year. So it's a simple fix by the Department of Treasury just to extend the tax credits because of the virus we're dealing with. Secondly, during the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act under President Obama, during that same period, companies weren't making money and they had limited tax liability. So we had what was called the 1603 cash grant program. So in lieu of taking the 30% federal tax credit, there was cash grants that were given that helped finance projects. So those are two simple things that Congress and the Department of Treasury can address to bring the solar industry back to where it was, or at least help alleviate the impact that we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's great. And, you know, I think that really pivots into our next question. And Daniel, you know, we need the American public to be behind climate solutions and to understand their value. Where do we start with getting the public support? Because, you know, we just spent the past couple minutes talking about how we need to triage, how we need to really stop the rapid loss of jobs. But ultimately, you know, how do we get the public to start thinking about some of these policy proposals that you spoke about previously?
Well, I'm sorry to say I don't have any silver bullets or even brass or, you know, bronze bullets or whatever for how to sort of persuade the broader public that carbon pricing and other ambitious climate policies are necessary. But there are some measures that I think do that are basically low-hanging fruit that could be deployed through stimulus over the near term, and that could also be useful over the next 6 months to a year kind of time period. And some of these are specifically about climate, and some of these are also about kind of local environmental problems, where government investment can at the same time employ a substantial number of people and solve environmental problems. Although these problems, in some cases they're climate related, in some cases they're not. So some of the specific ideas that I've heard or that I've been thinking about that I think could be quite popular in local communities that are struggling are, for example, if we look at oil and gas communities, those communities are being hit very, very hard by the incredibly low oil prices that we're seeing and continued low natural gas prices. There's an enormous need in many of these communities to plug abandoned oil and gas wells that have been abandoned over periods of decades or even centuries. And investing in the plugging of those wells would not only put oil and gas workers back to work, it would also reduce methane emissions from those wells. It would also reduce other environmental and human health risks associated with those wells. Similarly, there are a variety of locations in historically coal mining communities, in coal consuming communities, where there is substantial environmental remediation that is needed. And those projects could be very important for the long-term economic health of those communities that were struggling before the crisis and are probably struggling even more now. And so some of these short-term measures, I think, could be quite useful at the local level and could be quite valuable and popular. But again, it's not, I don't know how to sort of get the public on board with broader, ambitious climate policy goals. If I did, I would certainly be telling everyone from the top of my little mountain.
Yeah, and something I meant to ask you earlier, and I know you all touched on how you felt that we first need to triage and then we need to look into our investment opportunities. But it was just reported yesterday that oil and gas CEOs from the major companies are set to attend an in-person meeting at the White House tomorrow. And so the oil and gas industry is clearly lobbying for an investment in them by the federal government. So Daniel, do you think that renewable energy companies, clean tech, what should they be doing to ensure that they're getting funded, even if this is separate from kind of convincing the public? But how should they be lobbying for their interests and making their case right now? Because clearly the oil and gas CEOs have the ear of the president.
Right. So so I'm going to be a little careful in how I answer this because as you know, RFF, we're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy institution. And so I don't want to give the impression that I'm sort of conveying advocacy advice.
Sure.
But let me just offer a couple thoughts. I think it is understandable that there is a special focus on the oil industry right now. The oil industry is being hit not just by the lack of demand that all sectors are, or almost all sectors are experiencing right now. It's also being hit by a shock on the supply side, where Russia and Saudi Arabia are flooding the market with oil. And so those communities are really in a tight spot. And so I think it is appropriate to think about, specifically about those communities and how government might be able to support them. Just sort of late breaking news, I saw on Twitter maybe an hour ago, the president announced that he had spoken with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and they were discussing, according to the tweet, which may or may not be a reliable source of information. According to the tweet, they are discussing Russia and Saudi Arabia together cutting oil production by 10 and perhaps 15 million barrels per day. So those are eye-popping numbers. I would be surprised if that actually were come to pass. But anyway, that's just some news for our listeners if they haven't seen it already. One more thought, and then I'll pass the mic, is with the interest in the oil industry that I think we all know is there with Congress and the president, there is also probably an opportunity for renewable energy advocates to do some horse trading. And there's some historical precedent for this. If we look back to 2015, there was legislation in Congress that lifted the long-running restrictions on crude oil exports from the United States. And one of the sort of trades for that lifting of that provision, which helped the oil industry, was the extension of clean energy tax credits for wind and solar. And so one could imagine that there could be some similar horse trading in this context, although I don't know exactly how that would shake out and what policies specifically folks would be interested in pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one quick point, I don't know, Ellen or Daniel, if you want to make this, but what should the role for nuclear energy be right now? We're at a time where we're seeing nuclear plants close, but right now it currently is a source of emissions-free energy. So as we're seeing the oil industry really have these severe shocks and renewable energy, currently can't provide the entire base load. What should the role, what should the nuclear industry be pushing for themselves right now? And how should policymakers be looking at that industry?
I want to mention and direct the audience to the Third Way website, because we have a whole group of experts working on advanced nuclear. We've got Todd Allen, who is actually chair of the nuclear engineering department at the University of Michigan. He's also a senior non-resident fellow at Third Way, is doing great work in this area. Josh Freed, who heads up our climate and energy program, is an expert in advanced nuclear, and Jackie Kempfer, who also is just incredibly talented and an expert. Absolutely, advanced nuclear is such an important element to the future. I also wanted to add to what Daniel said, clean energy standards. I mean, yes, we'd all love carbon pricing, but we need to really, if we want to get to net zero emissions by 2050, we have got to think big. And Lindsay Walter at Third Way just did a paper with a couple of her colleagues around clean energy standards. And I think I just have everybody take a look at that paper because it's really valuable to kind of figure out how do you put a package together so that we can get to net zero by 2050. I mean, there are a lot of different ingredients. How about the University of Michigan's Global CO2 Initiative? They're looking and supporting scientists about how we suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. We've got Matt Bright at Third Way who's working on carbon capture and storage. All of these have to be kind of put together in a comprehensive strategic way. We can do it in the US. We have the science, we have the data, we know how to do these things. So I would just put a clarion call out. When we get past this terrible health crisis and storm, we've got to really pivot and look long run and say, let's put our best foot forward and develop a strategy to win on this.
Okay, got it. And to pivot back to the Recovery Act from 10 years ago, Gilbert, what are some of the lessons that we could learn from that policy mechanism that we could apply to rural and disenfranchised communities right now? Renewables are a great opportunity for some of these communities who have seen a big loss of jobs. So, what kind of parallels do you see between now and a decade ago that we might be able to use?
Okay, well, let me paint a picture from a decade ago. So a decade ago, we had our first green president, President Barack Obama, who at the time during the Great Recession said we need to make significant historic investments in clean energy. 1/8 of the investments in the stimulus bill in 2009 went to clean energy tax credits and low carbon technologies. And what that happened over the last 10 years, clean energy technologies in the industry has grown enormously. So look at solar. Solar jobs are growing at 5 times faster than the national economy. So when we're looking at the next bill, which is probably going to be infrastructure, we need to look back before the pandemic. What were the industries that were driving jobs? And the clean energy industries are that. So as we move forward, when we're talking about disenfranchised communities, specifically minority communities who have dealt with environmental racism for years, we need to be honest about that. When you look at African Americans, 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal power plant. African American youth are 3 times more likely to go to the hospital because of asthma. African American youth are 2 times more likely than their white counterparts to die from asthma. We're talking about a pandemic right now that has huge respiratory illnesses. So if we're going to make investments in future infrastructure, we need to do so in a way that's not making people sick, number one, but also number two is more equitable to the communities that have been hit the hardest. So what can we do? I think one of the things that's been working is community solar. For those who don't know what community solar is, if you live in a community where, say, you live in an apartment complex, if you live in a condo building, you can't get solar or affordable housing, you can buy solar from a developer that maybe has a solar farm or is putting on another building at a much lower rate. So my company is doubling down our investments in community solar with a specific focus on the low to moderate income community. So again, invest in industries that have a track record over the last 10 years of growing US economy, and then also do it in a way that's cleaner in the future, but is also equitable from a social standpoint.
Yeah, Gilbert, and I think that's a really important point. And I think this shows, how much climate change is also a health crisis, and how, air pollution kills 100,000 Americans earlier than they would otherwise die a year. And that's a huge problem. And it makes people more vulnerable to viruses that attack people's lungs. So this is all really connected. And I know that in a lot of your work and outreach that you do, you really talk about extending a welcoming hand to communities that have traditionally not been welcome or a part of the clean energy economy. And earlier this week, we saw civil rights leaders argue that new sources of energy may be less affordable in the inner city and frontline communities. So how can we ensure inclusivity and affordability as we scale renewable energy through this recovery process?
Thank you for that question. And that's something that's definitely a passion of mine. I think the first thing is we have to show up in vulnerable communities. It's low-income communities, minority communities, it's rural communities. As you mentioned before, it's a health crisis. But one of the things that we did early on was go to churches in underserved communities and do solar projects. And where it became a commonplace for people to go into church, whether it's youth, adults, or even senior citizens, to understand that this is solar technology, but also what are other things that we can do? Energy efficiency, weatherization. We've gone into schools in inner city communities, not just to do projects, but to do education. Talk to students about careers in renewable energy or careers in traditional energy and making them more aware. But it's also investing in projects in inner city communities. So we do a lot of work at historically Black colleges and universities. I mentioned in my earlier comments, I think community solar is a great avenue to be able to expand solar to communities that traditionally have not had it. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And I think that we can double and triple down as we build forward a new infrastructure going forward.
And to double and triple down on that, would you think that would take a federal investment? You know, do you work with other groups that maybe work in different regions of the country to kind of give lessons learned from what you've done and your outreach and the success that you've had?
Yes, so we work with a lot of other diverse developers and installers across the country. I wish there were more, but I sit on the board of the Solar Energy Industries Association, and their leadership has made a direct commitment to improving diversity, not only for jobs, but also wealth creation. So the industry is starting to realize that we have to tackle diversity and making an emphasis on low-income communities. And I think that it's smart policy to do so. And there's a lot of different things that can be done to do that. But I think the investments have to be targeted, in my opinion, first in underserved communities, including rural communities. If you think about, someone that's been working on coal power plants that has Black lung disease, or talked about African-American kids that have asthma, we have to focus on those communities first.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we are right at our time where we have to jump into our audience question portion, but I wanted to give each of the panelists just a moment for a closing thought, perhaps a positive thought that they might leave us off with. So Ellen, why don't we start with you?
Well, I do want to be optimistic, frankly, Moira, because I do think that we will get past this terrible health crisis and we'll get to a point where we can begin to turn and use the leadership. Just as Gilbert said, I mean, that's the kind of leadership we need to put together a whole host of actions we can take, not only to improve the job situation, especially for clean energy jobs, but also to make sure that we are consistently mitigating climate risks and getting to the net zero goal by 2050, if not sooner. But do it, as Gilbert said, in a fair and equitable way. We can't just boldly go ahead without thinking about this in a very equitable manner. So I just love the way that Gilbert talked about these issues. That was very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Daniel?
Thank you. I want to echo that sentiment that that as we go forward on ambitious climate policy or any policy, frankly, we need to do so with a clear intention and a clear focus on communities that have been disadvantaged in a variety of ways historically, and to try to be as inclusive and equitable as we possibly can going forward. One bright note that I'd like to leave people with is the opportunities for technology that the United States clearly has, and that we clearly have the opportunity to take advantage of. And as Ellen mentioned, there are researchers at think tanks in Washington, at universities like Michigan around the country that are working on really exciting new ideas, whether that's for the decarbonization of cement making, or the decarbonization of steel, or the production of green hydrogen, or the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration at scale, new nuclear. There are so many technologies that are just starting to bubble up from the labs, where there is an opportunity for the government to support early stage deployment, where we can really test these technologies out in the field. This is starting to happen in Europe. It's starting to happen in China. It's starting to happen at small scale in a couple places in the United States. But I think there's really an opportunity here for the federal government, because of its just financial might and its ability to spur investment in a very broad way, to support the deployment of these new technologies in the hardest to abate sectors of the economy, particularly the industrial sector, where we don't have a clear vision for what the future of those sectors are going to look like in a decarbonized or a zero net greenhouse gas emission society. So I think that's really an exciting area that I'm thinking about a lot, and that I hope the federal government will be able to turn its attention to.
Awesome. And Gilbert?
Yeah, I remain very optimistic as well. We're Americans. We've dealt with crisis in the past. We fall down, we get back up. We fall down, we get back up. We'll get back up, but we're at a crossroads. Are we going to, as we're talking about rebuilding our infrastructure, are we going to go back to the ways of the past and building infrastructures making people unhealthy? Or are we going to move forward and build an infrastructure that will provide cleaner air, cleaner water, and potentially more jobs, as well as creating more small businesses? So I'm optimistic that we will be able to move forward in the right way. And I pray for everyone on this call, your families and your friends, and God bless everyone.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was wonderful. And now we'll move into our audience Q&A. So I mentioned before, you should have a button on the bottom of your screen. And we'll go ahead and read through some of those and make sure we get them answered. Okay. So our first question comes from Taylor Osborne, and her question is, what state do you see the clean energy industry being after the dust clears from this pandemic? And do we have a panelist that wants to jump in to answer that one?
So the question was, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ellen.
Yes. The question was, what state do you see the clean energy industry being in after the dust clears from this pandemic?
I mean, I think that, as I shared before, it's been an industry that's been resilient through tariffs and other things that's been thrown at it. So I think it will continue to be resilient, but we are going to have to really lobby to our lawmakers to put forth good policy, and especially in this infrastructure bill, to make sure that we're investing in clean technology and make the case about jobs. This is an industry that's been creating jobs for the last 10 plus years. So why go away from it?
Yep, absolutely. I just want to ask if we have any more audience questions. Feel free to send these in here. But I do have one more for Gilbert. This comes from James Petrilla, who's actually one of our Daily Planet readers. And he asked, Gilbert, are you working at all with the National Rural Electric Co-ops to bring solar and wind to rural areas?
No, but I would love to. If you can reach out to me afterwards, that's something I definitely want to bridge the gap. You can probably hear my conversation with rural communities and minority communities, because that's something that definitely I'm passionate about. So would love to work with them.
Yeah, great. And they keep coming for you, Gilbert. So this one is from Julia Piper, and she asked, how can the clean energy industry keep workforce diversity at the forefront while managing through an economic crisis? That's a great question.
That's a very good question. I think part of it is representation. So part of it is, certain companies, as you grow, I think your board of directors should be diverse is one thing that can be done. I think a second thing is be very intentional in your hiring. Go to untraditional places where you're looking for employees. Go to historically Black colleges, universities that have School of Engineering or business schools. Reaching out to organizations like the American Associations of Blacks in Energy and tapping in their pool of candidates. Reaching out to SEIA, as I mentioned before, is make a concerted effort to make diversity more inclusive. Reach out to companies like me, and I'm happy to share, my network of folks that look like me that want to get in this space. So I think there's a lot of different things that can be done, and I'm just glad we're having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, there's a question for you from Gary Jonesy, and it says, to follow up on Daniel's patient analogy, a physician would not install a defective pacemaker to help a heart patient if a safe pacemaker was available and practical. So why bail out the auto, airline, and other polluting industries on a business as usual basis when cleaner options are not only practical, but obviously better for the respiratory health of Americans? It says, do you think that the clean energy advocates are in a weak position to try and horse trade for some green advances in the next coronavirus bailout bill?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I'll defer on the sort of political horse trading question and focus on the pacemaker analogy, which is a great one. I think. Well, I guess I don't totally agree with that analogy. I think my dad actually has a pacemaker, and if he didn't have it, then he might, die this week or so or next week. I think the long-term nature of environmental problems are just a little bit different from the short-term nature of the analogy that I happened to pick earlier today. And so I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges. Certainly, there are opportunities to find new ways to build our infrastructure, find new ways to get around that are less polluting, both in terms of greenhouse gases and in terms of local air pollution. But I think some of the technologies are simply not there yet. Airlines, for example. There certainly are opportunities for electrification, deployment of hydrogen, deployment of biofuels in the airline industry, but it's not ready at scale today. I don't think anyone would make that argument. There are similar challenges with long-distance transportation, heavy trucks, and the industrial sectors that I mentioned earlier. And so I think there certainly are opportunities for smart green spending in future stimulus that have the added benefit of stimulating the economy and reducing pollution. But I don't think we want to slow down or dramatically hamper the rebounding of the U.S. economy by tying it to aspirations that are simply not technologically there yet. And I think something like airline travel and heavy industry, those are two examples where the technologies are emerging, but they're not yet ready at scale.
Great. And then we have time for about 2 more questions. And Ellen, this question is for you from Justin Warland of Time Magazine. And he asks, I'm curious if Ellen can speak more about the implications of low oil prices on the future of electric vehicles. What are the implications of sustained low prices on the future of EVs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, if you would ask that question 10 years ago, I think I'd have a completely different answer. But because we have seen such significant advances in the technology around the battery, we're getting to a point now where battery electric vehicles are going to be very cost competitive in the global environment, in the global economy. I mean, if you look at what Europe is doing in terms of their CO2 regulations and China in terms of their policies, we in the US have to be competitive, and we have now a lot of innovation that is even going to take the cost of the battery down even further. So from a life cycle standpoint, we're better off, with electric vehicles as we look out over the next 5 to 10 years. And also, they're going to be more advantageous for consumers, even with low oil prices. So I think you're going to see similar to what you saw with wind and solar, where they became very cost competitive. We're also, in terms of the electric vehicle, going to be cost competitive. It's not like it was 10 years ago. I mean, we've had almost 100% decline in the cost of the battery since the year 2000.
Great. Time for one more quick question, and Gilbert, I will direct this to you before we have to wrap up here. But once the virus is further under control and attention and resources shift to stimulating the economy, what are your thoughts on leveraging the DOE loan guarantee program for commercially deploying novel clean energy technologies, including their supporting infrastructure? And that question comes from James Green.
James, thanks for that question. I'm definitely in support of that, and actually part of a DOE committee to review solar technologies next week. So I'm glad to see that they're still investing in technology of the future. So I definitely think that something I'm going to be partnering with, and we definitely need to do.
Yeah, and Daniel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that really quickly.
Sure. So just a quick thought about the DOE loan and loan guarantee programs that were deployed heavily under ARA. They were established in 2005 and expanded in 2007. And there's sort of two streams of them. One of them is called 1703, which historically has been used to support very large projects such as new nuclear builds. And then there's 1705, which has historically been used for more kind of middle-sized or moderate projects. 1705 got a lot of flack because of the Solyndra story back under ARA, which I'm sure all of us remember. But if you actually look at the performance of that loan portfolio over time, it was very successful. And that actually stands in contrast to the 1703 program, which has been a much bulkier program. It's received much less take up in the private sector. And so I think if we are thinking about expanding loan guarantees, then 1705 is probably the model to focus on. And I think it could be quite useful in not just the renewable energy space, but possibly some other new exciting energy technologies as well.
That's great. And, we promised all of our viewers a lunchtime session. So not to take up any more of your time, I just wanted to remind you that we're going to have the second part of the series on April 16th. And we'll be talking about what infrastructure looks like during the COVID-19 recovery. And I'll be moderating the panel along with Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, Alex Laska from Third Way, and Seth Guikema from University of Michigan. And Jared from Third Way will be putting the link in the chat feature for everyone to sign up. So just want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend and to ask questions. This was really great, and hopefully you can join us on April 16th. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting this.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.